Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Emily Stewart, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. And we are very excited to be hosting this event tonight with our Human Rights Certificate seniors. If you are at all interested in learning more about the Duke Human Rights Center or about our certificate program, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to meet with you or send you information. Just send a text through the chat and we can set something up. We're also excited this is the final event for the academic year, but you're welcome to join our listserv and learn more about upcoming events that will start in the fall and other opportunities to get involved with the Human Rights Center. You can also learn more about our work from the website, and I'm going to post a link in the chat to a page that features interviews with all of our amazing seniors so that you can get to know them a little bit more. They are going to be presenting tonight. So I'll add that to the chat right now so you can start learning about them. And before we begin, I want to mention that over the last year, students from the Native American Student Alliance, staff, faculty from Duke, UNC, NC State, and members of local Native nations have been participating in a land acknowledgement committee. The purpose of this committee is to center Native students' intentions in creating land acknowledgements and to consult with local Native tribes about the practice of reading them in a university setting. I want to honor that we're still in this process, so I won't give a formal land acknowledgement now, but invite everyone to learn more about the land you live on and the Native people who currently still live there or who have historically lived there. And I'll also put a link in the chat to a helpful guide and a map so that you can learn more. There we go. We will not have live captioning tonight, but we'll add captions to the video before we post it on the YouTube channel next week, and we'll send it out to our listserv. And lastly, there will be an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation, so please feel free to write them in the chat. The chat is completely open and you can send direct messages or send a message to everyone who's participating tonight. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to the Duke Human Rights Center's Executive Committee member, Nancy McLean. Oh, Nancy, you're muted.
It's been said that the most commonly used phrase of the last year is "you're muted." Anyway, I am Nancy McLean, and I had the pleasure of teaching the wonderful students that you will hear from tonight. I'm so happy to see so many people here to see their work. And I'd like to offer a special welcome to their family members and friends. I know the students are really excited to share their creation with you especially, and we're delighted for also all the participants in our programming at the Human Rights Center to be joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge others in the Duke Human Rights Center community who are here with us tonight. Robin Kirk, our director, who taught these capstone students in the Introduction to Human Rights course and excited them about these issues way back when. Emily Stewart, who you just heard from, who worked with each of our graduating seniors as they completed their certificates and really is the heart and soul of this program in many ways. And also the other faculty advisory board and student advisory board members who are with us. We have an incredibly engaged community at the Human Rights Center, and this is one of those moments when it's really good to be together. I believe we even have, although I can't see the full screen now, one alumnus, Trey Walk, with us, who since his graduation 2 years ago has been working squarely in the field of human rights at the Equal Justice Institute in Montgomery, Alabama. So welcome, one and all. We are delighted to have you here. Before I turn things over to those you really want to hear from, this year's capstone students, let me just say a few words about how they came to create what they're about to show you. In past years in this program, students in the capstone have typically written an individual thesis. But college life in the pandemic is a whole other thing. And my colleague who taught the seminar last spring, James Chappell, had the wisdom to suggest that the last thing spring seniors who were already isolated by COVID needed was individual projects that would further isolate them, given the situation. Why not, James suggested, a group project instead? So that was the beginning of what you'll encounter this evening. We prepared for our project with 5 weeks of historical readings with emphasis on 3 key eras in the development of human rights: the 1940s in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust, the 1970s as citizens were challenging authoritarian regimes from Latin America to the USSR, and the 1990s as women from all over the world came together at the 1996 UN-sponsored World Conference on Women in Beijing to declare that women's rights are human rights, and then to go home to their varied countries to put meat on the mantra. We then dug into North Carolina history since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1947 to understand the broader context of the events that we'd be researching and commemorating. Throughout this process, we talked about how our history is now remembered and commemorated, and what is left out and why, and what a difference it might make to tell students who are coming through the schools in future generations a fuller story, a story in which all people matter, and we can learn from their pain and their struggles, as well as their joy and achievements. Along the way, we received excellent guidance from archivists, librarians, oral historians, and leaders of kindred projects. And here I just want to give a special shout out to Barbara Lau of the Pauline Murray Project, and also another faculty advisory board member at the DHRC. And she has also done with a class a Duke civil rights history map, a Durham civil rights history map, which I encourage you to check out. And most importantly, she shared with us her vast knowledge of how to do public history in an appealing way. And we learned a ton from her. You'll be the judges of whether we succeeded, but we certainly tried to heed the advice we got. For now, though, I just want to commend the students that you'll be hearing from tonight. The 8 seniors who will be speaking have been the most thoughtful, caring, intellectually searching, and collectively engaged group I've had the pleasure of teaching at Duke. And I find their achievement extraordinary. They used the challenging circumstances of the pandemic to create something powerful and lasting to give back to the state where they received their college educations. This will be a continuing project for DHRC, as you'll learn more about later in the event when we welcome your ideas for other moments that future classes can mark in the project. But they have just been extraordinary. So I just wanted to say what a pleasure it has been to work with you. And the fact that we have such a beautiful group project to share with you is partly because of our project assistant, Josh Strayhorn. Josh, if you're out there somewhere, please wave. Josh is a history graduate student from New Bern, North Carolina, who's now embarking on his own North Carolina history research related to human rights, but in the 19th century. Josh was our story map master whose expertise and patience helped each student to do their very best work in this format. So Josh, thank you. We all appreciate your work so much. And with that, let me hand it over to one of the students, Multi Oliver, who will be our MC this evening.
Thank you so much, Professor. Those are very kind words. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Multi Oliver. I use she, her pronouns, and I am one of the students of this capstone course. I'm majoring in public policy with a minor in theater studies and the human rights certificate. And I am from St. Petersburg, Florida. I am very interested in the intersection between human rights and the arts, and I believe this course really let me explore those interests further. My classmates and I are very excited to present our research today. We've been working hard to jumpstart this project for our future human rights colleagues, as our professor spoke about. We couldn't have done this without the help and support from several Duke University library staff members, our friends at the Human Rights Center, and in special cases, even the subjects of our research. We started by selecting our research interests, and then we each curated 3 stories for the map. We're a class full of students with very diverse interests, and you will definitely see that in the variety of our map entries that range from protests, from artistic endeavors, from musicians all over North Carolina. I'm sure my classmates will agree, but I really appreciated the ability to choose the stories that really spoke to my own interests. It gave us a little more agency, and I think it made us more excited to research each topic. As a class, we decided our target audience for this map is high school and middle school students and their teachers. We think it's really important to begin human rights education at a younger age, as many of us, myself included, didn't start our human rights journey until college. I have loved learning about some of these unsung stories of human rights and significant human rights events, and it made it even more special that we stayed local to North Carolina. Our main goal is to highlight how North Carolina is a battleground for human rights. Two of my classmates, Siandra and Cece, both grew up in North Carolina in the North Carolina education system. And so I wanted to let them speak more on our decision to focus on North Carolina and what it means for them as North Carolina natives.
Hi, everyone. My name is Siandra. I am from Greensboro, North Carolina, majoring in psychology and African American studies. So my focus on human rights derives from researching systemic racism and its effects on education, mass incarceration, housing, and Black mental health. And so just thinking about the need for a resource such as this and thinking about how we can decentralize whiteness within education and the need for more inclusive and representative history. It's kind of how we approach this research, and what really inspired me to having that North Carolina context and be able to see my state history from a more holistic lens, and how all of the events that took place kind of build upon each other, and just the effects of certain historical moments and how they inform the current state of North Carolina today. I even think about just like my own background and experience in high school, where I did have exposure to Black studies by working on my African-American quiz bowl team in high school, and the role that that served in helping me to see history, Black history at the local level, in the state level, and the national level, and influenced me majoring in African-American studies today. And so just to hope for students who read this history to see themselves represented in their state, in the history of their state, and how we built up North Carolina.
Hi, I'm Cece. I'm a philosophy major at Duke, and I'm pursuing certificates in human rights and Latino studies of the Global South. I grew up in Salisbury, North Carolina, and attended Salisbury High School before coming to Duke. Despite receiving my entire education in North Carolina, it wasn't until I came to Duke, much like Siandra, that I gained an understanding of what human rights was and became interested in learning more about its history and importance in both domestic and international contexts. And the only reason I really happened upon human rights at Duke was really out of luck and out of my interest in the legal field. At the beginning of my second year at Duke, I signed up for Dr. Juliet Duara's course on human rights and legal redress, really because I had extra space in my schedule. And as a pre-law student, the legal aspect of her course really interested me. It was in this course that I learned about human rights for the first time and was introduced to the human rights certificate at Duke. I really credit Professor Duara's course. It was so engaging and rich, and it inspired me to not only become a part of the human rights certificate program at Duke, but to focus my eventual career path on human rights law. Because I came from such little prior understanding of what human rights consisted in, much like Siandra did, I felt as though I was playing kind of a game of catch up in some of my human rights courses. And to have learned about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, either in the context of American and North Carolina history prior to my time at Duke, would have provided me with an incredibly helpful foundation for my eventual pursuit of a human rights certificate. It also would have assured me that human rights was something I wanted to study further and eventually pursue it as a career. And I feel fortunate that I happened upon this subject matter by chance, but I'm really saddened to think, or by the thought that, there are students who may be similarly as passionate as me about the protection and enforcement of human rights, but who may never seem to happen upon the same chance to discover that passion that I did. Learning about human rights resources like the map we've produced, I hope, will allow students in North Carolina to better understand human rights as a concept and to have a more realistic and informed perception of their local, state, and national communities. More importantly, I believe arming students with the knowledge of past human rights abuses will allow them to better recognize such abuse and prevent the further degradation of their own rights and the rights of all humans at large. And I will pass to Dan, who is going to guide us through our maps features.
I think first Nerea is going to talk, and then I'm going to guide us through after.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Nerea Price, and I'm studying public policy and African American studies, and obviously receiving a certificate in human rights. It's so exciting to see so many guests here today. Similar to Cece and Siandra, I was going to share a bit of my perspective of why I chose to pursue a certificate in human rights. I actually initially wanted to pursue a certificate in prison studies, And then I became deeply interested in issues of educational inequity and how our education system could be utilized to create a more inclusive and equitable society. And I really found the intersection of those issues in our introductory human rights course. I have to shout out Professor Kirk, and it's really exciting to see her here today because her course truly showed me how human rights and the human rights framework are what we utilize to create a society that is inclusive and thoughtful and is equitable and thinks of all people. And I think part of what I want to highlight is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was an incredibly important document and kind of was the founding springboard of human rights, not only in this country, but across the world. So when we think about this map and what its creation and what it stands for and what hopefully middle school and high school students glean from it, the story really begins with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Eleanor Roosevelt and her integral role in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Dan's going to continually guide us through the map, but I hope you all enjoy. And it's going to go by date and decades. So please enjoy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Raftis. I'm a biology major at Duke, minoring in chemistry and also in the human rights certificate. I'm also from upstate New York. So yeah, I'm going to walk you through the map today. Just a couple things. I thought it'd be helpful to go over our overall design and kind of layout of this project we've been working on. So we put this project on a program called Story Maps, and Story Maps has tons of different features and displays. It has allowed us to include 20 different entries on different events throughout North Carolina with pictures and videos and even newspaper clips. And it's been a really great platform for us to share these stories. So this is our title page. The actual picture in the background was designed by one of my classmates, Eritrea. As you walk through the map, in the very beginning, we just have an introduction about what this map is and what human rights are and what they mean to both us and within the context of the state of North Carolina. As I showed you earlier, we then go into Eleanor Roosevelt and the Declaration of Human Rights, which is really the core and basis of human rights history, more modern human rights history, and everything that we've been talking about. In terms of the actual layout and design of our project, with the goal in mind of one, trying to make this a useful tool for further education for middle school and high school students, and also a place that can be ever expanding as more Duke students every year add to it. We decided to go with a layout that both organized our entries based on geography and chronologically. So first thing, this right here is we have it's an interactive map of the state of North Carolina and all the entries we have. So like, for example, I can click here on entry in Charlotte. And when you click, I'll bring up a short little excerpt about what the entry is, the title of the entry, and what decade it took place in. So you can move around on the website and you'll be able to click through and go and see where different entries are located, whether it's in Western or Eastern North Carolina. And I think this really just gives a good perspective of all the different human rights topics and locations that have occurred around the state. In terms of our actual entries, we decided we wanted to do it chronologically. So as you can see here, I don't know if you can actually see my mouse or not, but we have this very useful bar that has the decades ranging from the 1940s to the 2000s. And this is how we've separated our entries. And you can move around between each decade and look at each of the different entries as you scroll through and see the entries. So then I'm going to pass it back to our MC Malty, and I think we're going to start going through our stories.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you so much, Dan. Okay, so now for the exciting part. We are each going to share our entries in chronological order, as Dan was saying, as they appear in the story maps, but we will be doing this in quick research slam form, which means 1 minute to 2 minutes to tell you about each story. So make sure you're listening closely. And without further ado, I will hand it off to our first presenter.
Everyone, my name is Eritrea, and I'll be presenting the first entry on Velma Hopkins. But first, I'm from Memphis, Tennessee originally, and I'm studying sociology, public policy, and Spanish, and of course, human rights. So Velma Hopkins is actually in our list of initial human rights leaders in North Carolina. And I was really interested in learning more about her because of the intersections of different identities that she had as a working class Black woman. And she was a very important labor organizer in the Winston-Salem area. And her work really addressed issues of the right to equal dignity, freedom from discrimination, and the right to form and join unions. And she specifically worked around forming the first and only union at R.G. Reynolds Tobacco Company. And it was just really incredible to see the kind of impact she had and the legacy that she left behind at RGR and the Winston-Salem area in general. And for me, a really key takeaway was the fact that even though this happened over almost 80 years ago, you can still see the very direct impacts that she's had. And I included a statement from Erlene Parman, who was the first Black representative from Forsyth County. And she said how Hopkins taught me how to stand up for what's right without fear of being intimidated. And so I thought Wilma Hopkins' work as a labor organizer and later on after her time at RGR, helping to desegregate schools in North Carolina and to register Black voters in the area, just really showed how dedicated she was to human rights across the state.
Hey everyone, I'm Sarah. I'm from Cape Coral, Florida. I'm a public policy major with a minor in history and of course, certificate in human rights. So I chose to talk about North Carolina's sterilization program because it is relatively unknown, but these laws were in place in at least 30 other states during the 20th century, in particular in North Carolina, but also in other states. They targeted Black women predominantly, especially in the second half of the 20th century. I also chose this because it's an ongoing story. North Carolina was the first state to provide reparations to the victims of sterilization, but there are still questions going around about, is monetary reparations enough, and what can the state do to redress for the crimes that it committed essentially against its own citizens? And this continued activism and pressure being placed on governments, that's not just happening in North Carolina, that's happening elsewhere in the United States as well. And finally, these larger debates that we're currently having about the right to choice and bodily autonomy, particularly when it comes to women, are really what's underlying this sterilization program. And so I think it's interesting to see how these tensions about rights really are a continued trend throughout our history and to current day, even when we're not talking about sterilization.
Hi, everyone. So this is my entry about the Lumbee Indians and their fight against the KKK in the 1950s. And so I chose this as a reference point for the story map because it really shows how racial violence in the 1950s and 1960s extended to other groups. And so the Lumbee in Robeson County faced threat from the KKK, and in this powerful battle, which became known as the Battle of Haines Ponds, hundreds of Lumbee came together to stop a Klan rally in their county. And so just hundreds of Lumbee Indians who were veterans all showing up, coming out and fighting off the Klan who originally came out there to put them in their place. And I think this was just a great historical moment just because something actually, one, they scared off the KKK, and on top of that, repercussions for the actions that took place came through as basically a major victory and a major site of Lumbee activism during that time period.
Hi, everyone. So for my entry, they were all linked. I'm actually a senior at UNC Chapel Hill. And in kind of the culmination of my time at UNC, I wanted to think deeply about the Black individuals who paved the way through tragedy and triumph for me to be here and learn and be educated at this university. So I did 3 entries. The first being the 3 Black men who courageously paved the path at UNC, integrating the university in 1955. Those being Lefroy Fraser, Ralph Fraser, and John Lewis Brandon, who were 3 Black males from neighboring town, Durham. And these 3 men, obviously, along with other Black students for many years, faced continual oppression and just incredible triumph and trials in their time at UNC and in their attempt to get an education. So that was the first part of my entry, really focusing on them and their story of desegregating the university. But I didn't want to tell that desegregation story through one lens. I really thought it was important to also think about the voices that have been silenced in the history of attempting to integrate this university. So James Lewis Cates Jr. Was a 22-year-old sophomore, I believe, or no, I'm sorry, a senior, I believe, when he was murdered at one of actually the first integrated dances at UNC Chapel Hill. And his story is really not told in the history books, and it's one that very recently is being kind of commemorated by the UNC Chapel Hill community, but it's one that is incredibly important to me and was quite a tragedy to learn about. His body sat in the quad for quite some time and was just, there was a lack of recognition and fight for his life, and just a real lack of humanity on behalf of the university to show for this student. Those who killed him never faced repercussions for their actions. And when I think about those who paved the way and the tragedies that had to occur or occurred for me to be a student at this university, I think of James Lewis Cates, and I think of the importance of telling his story and never forgetting who he is. And lastly, I think about Pauli Murray, who, on a more positive note, but someone who applied to UNC in 1938 to get a PhD here. I'm sure many of you know who she is, as we've already mentioned today. But applied to UNC and was denied on the basis of her race. So I think about Pauli Murray, who took that denial and was a spark for her to continue breaking barriers, and not only for Black people, but for Black women specifically. As many of you know, Pauli Murray went on to be a human rights hero, truly, from North Carolina, and someone that the University of North Carolina truly missed out on educating. So when I think about the process of integration at the university that I received my education, I think of these, 3 entries, among many other things, but things that I just wanted to highlight that occurred for me to be here today. And it was an incredible joy to put together these 3 entries and think about the intersection of just so many Black individuals who have done incredible work to make this university a more inclusive and safe space for me and my peers of color today.
So my next entry is about Max Roach, and I really wanted to do an entry about music and protest music during the Civil Rights Movement. So I kind of just Googled protest music, North Carolina, and Max Roach came up, and I was really surprised because I'd never heard about him before, but he had a really amazing legacy as a jazz composer and drummer. And he didn't grow up for much time in North Carolina, but he was born in Pasquotank County in Eastern North Carolina. And then his family moved to New York when he was 4 years old. And by the time he was 10, he started learning how to play several different instruments. And he had a really incredible kind of insight into his music, and he really had a point of trying to ground it in reality. And in this interview that I also link below, he talks about how he doesn't want his music to kind of be a form of escape and to ignore what's happening in reality, but to actually talk about the issues that he was facing as a Black man and the Black community was facing in general. And so I was able to come across this really incredible album that he co-produced in 1960 that was a direct response to the Greensboro sit-ins. And he talks, there's 5 songs, and they all have to do with the Civil Rights Movement as well as the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And I thought it was really incredible to see kind of a jazz album that addressed not only civil rights issues in the US, but also internationally, and recognizing that anti-Blackness is not just a US issue, but a global issue. And so I thought, this album was just a really great reflection of that. And I think if anyone has time to listen to it, it's on YouTube. It's a really great album. And I wanted to play a section of it. The middle song of the album is called Triptych, and I'll be playing a 30-second clip right now. you might be listening to that and think, sounds like someone screaming, and that is correct. She screams for About. It's Abby Lincoln, who worked with Max Roach for several years, and they were married at one point. But that specific part of that piece was intentional, and she screams for about, I think, a minute and a half. And it was meant to kind of reflect like the anguish and pain. And that's why the middle part of Triptych is protest, because it was to show like the screams and the agony and kind of like what the community was feeling at that time. And so it got a lot of backlash because it was such a visceral kind of judgment, right? And there was a visceral kind of rallying cry behind all these issues, racial justice issues that were happening in the US. And so I think looking at musicians like Max Roach and how their music was so political and so poignant is like really amazing to see and look back at how music and art in general really reflected the movements of this time.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zara Porter, and I'm from Lawrenceville, Georgia, and I'm a senior studying public policy with a minor in global health. And one of my entries that I chose was Ella Baker, and I chose her as one of my stories because of her immense influence during the Black freedom movement and contributing to organizations such as the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and founding the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960 at Shaw University, her alma mater. And throughout her 50 years of activism, she really pushed for the right for Black Americans to participate equally in the electoral process and confront discrimination. And I think what will stay with me from her story is really her dedication to activism and building leadership skills in others. One of Baker's most famous quotes is, "Give people light and they will find a way." And this was her organizing principle. She mentored and inspired a new generation of student leaders to continue this work, and I'm inspired by her today.
Hi again, everyone. So as I mentioned, I'm very interested in the intersection between the arts and human rights. So I chose Nina Simone as one of my entries. Nina Simone was a force to be reckoned with. She was born in Tryon, North Carolina, and she went on to become a renowned artist. She's known as the High Priestess of Soul, and she earned that title with her one-of-a-kind voice. But I wanted to spotlight her impact on the civil rights movement through her protest music. So at the expense of her fame, Nina Simone released protest songs like Mississippi Goddamn, The Old Jim Crow, and her cover of Strange Fruit to highlight the violence against Black bodies during the 60s. Radio stations would refuse to play her music. She was denied access to venues because her lyrics were unapologetic. She prioritized the fight for equal rights over her popularity. And she performed at the March from Selma to Montgomery, and she worked with the famous Langston Hughes to create music that moved listeners and spread awareness about the civil rights movement. And so she said, although it was hard to reduce figures like Medgar Evers and other victims of civil rights movement to a song, she did it with dignity, and she did it in a way that honored their legacy. And thanks to her, artists today can look to her work and continue to use music as a tool for social justice. And then I wanted to include a clip of her performance of Mississippi Goddamn, if Dan could go ahead and play that.
Mississippi Goddamn is our last tune. We had some requests for it. Alabama's got me so upset. Tennessee made me lose my rest. And everybody knows about Mississippi Goddamn. Alabama's got me so upset. Tennessee made me lose my rest. Everybody knows about Mississippi Goddamn. Can't you see it? I know you can feel it. It's all in the air. I can't stand the pressure much longer. Somebody say a prayer.
Thank you. And so as you can see, she explicitly talks about the events of the civil rights movement, and she points out that we cannot ignore the violence that's happening against African Americans. And I think it was very, very honorable of her to put that as a priority over listening to the radio stations that refused to play her afterwards. So thank you.
Hi again, everyone. So my first entry that I chose to write about was the unlikely friendship of Anne Atwater and C.P. Ellis here in Durham, North Carolina. So I was originally interested in this after watching the 2002 documentary on their relationship by Diane Bloom in one of my classes, and was just fascinated by how two people just so completely different could come together to work towards something good and eventually even create a lifelong friendship. So more recently, this friendship turned into a Hollywood blockbuster movie. So many of you might be familiar with it, but for those who don't know, Anne Atwater in the 1970s and 1960s was a very well-known Black activist in Durham. And C.P. Ellis, who's right here, was at the time the leader of the Ku Klux Klan in Durham. And Durham in the 1970s was having a really hard time with school integration. So they decided to come together and to create these 10-day town meetings to try to solve problems and work on school integration. And these two very, very different people were picked to co-chair the meetings. And at first, they were people who hated each other, but really their story of coming together and trying to solve problems just shows that how polarized our world is. But in the end, a lot of people all have the same goals, which for them was to provide a safe and adequate education for their children. And I just think they're a remarkable example of how human rights can unite people from very extraordinarily different backgrounds. Here's a nice picture of them many years later after their initial meeting on the school board session.
So my next entry is about the protest at the Raleigh Central Prison. In 1975, 150 women prisoners staged a peaceful sit-in on the grass of their prison yard at the North Carolina Correctional Center for Women in Raleigh, North Carolina. This deals with the article that is the article of the human rights that protests the unfair and unjust treatment of prisoners. They protested the unjust conditions in the prison. They were forced to do the laundry of the entire state prison system. This included tuberculosis infected laundry of 2 state sanitariums. They did this laundry without any protective equipment, gloves or masks. And if they were to get sick, they would then have to deal with the medical neglect of their health team. They were grossly mistreated, and many of them were refused treatment because the nurses thought they were faking, including a woman who nearly died of a ruptured appendix because they didn't believe that she was in pain. So I chose this entry because an interesting aspect of this protest is that it involved many different organizations in the area, such as the Black Panthers, Action for Forgotten Women, and the Triangle Area Lesbian Feminists. It was a uniquely large group effort to spotlighting prisoners' rights and one of the first of its kind, and they were able to shut down the laundry. But even though they were able to shut down the laundry, many prisons today still use unpaid or very, very underpaid prison labor, and they exploit prisoners today as a form of unjust and unequal treatment.
So my next entry was one that I was really excited for to just include it in North Carolina human rights history, which is Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou's work really inspired me when I was in middle school, and just getting into poetry as a form of expression and wanting to meet more about Black scholars and writers. And while Maya Angelou is not native to North Carolina, she did spend the remainder of her years here after taking a lifetime teaching position at Wake Forest University in 1982. One of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou, which gets at when we talk about human rights and the universality of human rights, is her quote that I am human, nothing human can be alien to me. And so just thinking about Angelou's work as a writer and teacher who focused on appealing to our collective humanity while advocating for the rights of Black people is so inspiring, and a story that I hope can inspire just the next generation of human rights scholars and activists to really connect with our individual humanity and really use that to appeal to us. And then
So the next one is the Greensboro Massacre. And this really tells us just one story in sort of a long book in US history about distrust in police and the justice system and why that exists. In this case, both institutions failed to protect citizens or hold perpetrators of violence accountable. And so it's just this really grim story that happened not too long ago in 1979. However, amidst all of that, we have this glimpse of hope with the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is a transitional tool that's generally used abroad in post-conflict societies. This is actually its first implementation in the US because the community got together and decided they needed a way to build trust and healing within the community, but also between the community and institutions. And to do so, they need to know what exactly happened on that fateful day and the failures of the justice system to address these crimes that were committed. And it is a really powerful tool. It could be very successful, assuming everyone is fully committed to the process. Finally, this really tells us the power of community action, what they can do when they come together and accomplish and uncover human rights violations in the pursuit of justice and healing.
So for my final entry, I wrote about the Wilmington 10. And so the case of Wilmington 10 is interesting because it not only deals with wrongful conviction, but it also deals with school desegregation and just how harmful it was to Black students entering these previously all-white schools and the violence that they faced within that space. And so the case of the Wilmington 10, in 1972, they were wrongfully convicted for arson and sentenced to a total of 282 years in prison. So this was a violation of human rights in terms of the presumed innocence until proven guilty and the right to a fair trial. The prosecutors in the case basically stacked the juries. They dismissed a lot of Black jurors from being there to hear their case, as well as they bribed witnesses to say that to implicate the 10 in the crime that took place. And so in 1977, Amnesty International actually took on the case of the Wilmington 10 and called them prisoners of conscience. And it took some years, but they finally were exonerated and did not have to complete the rest of their time in prison.
For my final entry, I will be talking about the Hayti Heritage Center. The Hayti Heritage Center is very near and dear to my heart because I have worked with Hayti since this past summer. What makes Hayti an important human rights location is their dedication to providing a community space for people in Durham that want to celebrate the African American arts and culture while also celebrating the history of the Hayti district in Durham. The Hayti district used to be known as the Black Wall Street of Durham. It has been commented on by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it used to have thriving enterprises by Black members of the community. Unfortunately, due to urban renewal and gentrification, the Hayti district and community has kind of been split in half, but the Hayti Heritage Center still exists today. I first learned through the Human Rights Intro course that access to artistic and cultural endeavors of the community is a universal human right. And in this way, Hayti is providing a very important resource to the community. They offer a wide variety of programming and events that highlight Black excellence, and also classes that provide quality arts education to members of the community that may not seek out these opportunities otherwise. So I hope that this entry will encourage people to attend their events and support their organization, and also spotlight the importance of the arts as a more recognized aspect of human rights.
So my first entry is in regards to the toxic waste dump that was located in Warren County, North Carolina. And really what it focuses on and why I chose it is because it's such a clear example of the human rights violations by the state of North Carolina and their disregard really for the well-being of low-income and Black communities. Essentially in 1978, a company dumped roughly 60,000 tons of toxic waste containing PCBs, which were known to cause cancer and birth defects and other harmful medical diseases and along the roadways of North Carolina. Eventually, the state of North Carolina fined them and they cleaned up all the contaminated soil and decided somewhat arbitrarily, they said, to build a landfill in a poor, low-income, primarily Black community of Warren County, even though the community of Warren County did not meet any of the EPA's environmental regulations for such a landfill that contains so much contaminated toxic waste. So really starting in 1982 with the construction of the landfill, there were protests and coalitions built to stop the filling of the landfill that had been built with the toxic waste. Protesters formed a multiracial coalition after the original coalition, which was mainly made up of primarily white members, had failed to stop the construction of the landfill itself. And really what stuck with me about this case is the longevity of its consequences. They were not able, the multiracial coalition was not able to prevent the state of North Carolina from filling the landfill with the toxic waste. And it actually remained in Warren County until 2004, until 100% of the landfill, the soil had been detoxified, and it ended up costing the state around $25 million to do so. And so really their disregard took years of harm to that resulted in years of harm to that community, as well as in a large cost. And it seemed as though a lot of that was based on the fact that they chose this small, predominantly African American community to host it without really considering the fact that there would be these protests and there would be this denial from the community and a strength that was built around it.
Hello, so I chose Susan Hill as my second entry because I know a lot of people have heard about the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade in 1973 that made abortion legal in the US, but you might not have heard the name of Susan Hill, a Durham-born activist inspired by the Supreme Court decision to co-found the National Women's Health Organization and open abortion clinics. Human right. And throughout her work, Hill testified on Capitol Hill and served as plaintiff on numerous cases, some that went all the way to the Supreme Court. She won them all, despite facing personal threats and harassment. She never wavered in her belief and commitment that a woman's rights to make choices over her reproduction was a fundamental human rights issue. And I think the aspect of Hill's story that will stick with me the most is just her persistence in ensuring all women have access to reproductive health care. Her contributions continue to inspire lots of us today.
So my next event is the Hamlet fire that occurred in 1991. I chose this story really because of the level of tragedy and the sheer preventability of it. So essentially in 1991, in a chicken processing plant in Hamlet, North Carolina, a fire broke out on the factory floor and spread very quickly. Employees raced to fire doors in order to escape the flames, but unfortunately, the owner of the plant had locked the doors from the outside, boarded the windows in an effort to do these things in order to produce greater profits for the plant itself.
Your sound has gone off. Cece, are you there?
I think she might have just dropped out of the call unless she's back.
Sorry, I'm back.
So I guess we'll go on from here, but I hope everybody will take a chance to read that entry. There's also a poem that she used from one of the survivors. She's in Salisbury actually for a big event at her sister's school that's starting soon. So she might have had to leave just then. But anyway, we'll keep moving. Zara.
Yeah, so my third entry was a story about Junius Wilson, and I decided to elevate his story because it demonstrates the human rights violations that can occur right in your own state. And so Wilson, an innocent and deaf man, was falsely accused of rape at the age of 17 and sent to the criminally insane ward at Cherry Hospital in 1925 in Goldsboro because the judge and jury assumed Wilson's inability to speak or hear was a sign of lunacy. And so during that time, he lived in rat-infested wards, experienced castration under the sterilization laws that Sarah spoke about earlier, and lived in isolation. Wilson didn't receive a translator until 1992, almost 70 years after his initial sentencing. And so Wilson ended up spending a total of 76 years on the hospital's campus until his death. And at the core, Wilson's story is a narrative about how racism, wrongful confinement, and forced sterilization can lead to a major human rights failure. For me, this story reveals the importance of learning about the human rights violations and achievements in our state as motivation to continue the struggle of fighting for these rights and preventing future indignities like this story from occurring.
Hi, sorry, I lost connection just a moment ago. I'm so sorry about that, but the Hamlet fire is very interesting. And if you are able at all to go and look at my entry, I'm sure it'll provide you a lot of insight onto the right of workers to form and join trade unions and the freedom from cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment. So for this treatment, it is about the torture flights that took place between 2001 and 2004 in the Kinston and Smithfield airports in Johnston County, North Carolina. And really it documents the Aero contractors' involvement in the rendition, detention, and interrogation program that had been launched by President George Bush after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York City. Essentially, the CIA orchestrated disappearances, torture, and indefinite detentions without charge of suspected terrorists for over 4 years. And many of these rendition flights took place in North Carolina or were flown through North Carolina. And really what my piece focuses on is a group known as the North Carolina Stop Torture Now activist groups, and sort of what they focus on is promoting the human right of freedom from cruel and inhumane or degrading treatment of punishment. And I sort of highlighted the North Carolina Inquiry on Commission of Inquiry on Torture that they were able to garner support around, since they could not get their local government or state government to recognize or do an investigation into the torture that took place in North Carolina's part in these the torture and rendition and detention interrogation program that was put by the CIA and manufactured by the Aero, or supported by Aero contractors in North Carolina.
So my second entry was about the protests of the execution of Kenneth Lee Boyd at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to write about, I knew I wanted to write about some of the work of Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who is a preacher, activist, and writer from North Carolina. And I was lucky enough to actually connect with him. And we talked extensively about his protests and demonstrations in 2005 against the death penalty in North Carolina. And specifically, we talked about Kenneth Lee Boyd, who was the 1000th execution in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. Specifically, Jonathan and several other activists tried to prevent the execution by blocking the roadway into the prison and were subsequently arrested and taken away. I just felt that this was a very powerful story to hear from him firsthand, and just really demonstrates this ongoing battle we have today as we try to eliminate the death penalty, both in North Carolina and nationally. What really stuck out to me the most is being able to hear firsthand from Jonathan what he did. And he also connected me with the photographer of these photos. And I just really enjoyed getting to talk with both of them and really understand the type of activism and work that they do. So the next entry is also mine. I chose to write about the Moral Mondays movement. When deciding about what I wanted to write about, I knew I wanted to talk about some of the work of Reverend William Barber. I learned quite extensively about him in a human rights class last semester, and all of the achievements and the hard work he does for human rights in the state of North Carolina and beyond. But for specifically, I focused on the first Moral Monday protest, which occurred at the General Assembly in North Carolina. These protests that were going on were in response to a lot of the policies that were enacted in 2002 by the North Carolina state government, which Reverend Barber and many activists believed were immoral and a rollback on a lot of policies the state had initially. I think that this entry is just extremely important for human rights because it's a great example of how different people from all different backgrounds from around the state of North Carolina and beyond were able to come together consecutively Mondays for a whole year. And even still today, there is Moral Monday protests to build a coalition of people to come together and push back against policies which they believe to be immoral.
So for my third and final entry, I wanted to sort of touch on my interest in the intersection between different human rights issues, and the union organizing efforts over the years at Case Farms and Morgantown are exactly that. It demonstrates this intersection between immigrant rights and labor rights. It's moreover a story of perseverance. The employees here, the majority of which are immigrants, have had successes in their efforts to gain union representation, only to be rebuked by their company, and yet they still fight for their rights and for better working conditions. It's sort of emblematic of the whole human rights struggle in general, right? It can feel sometimes like you take one step forward and get pushed back 2 steps. But then, you're reminded that this is why you do it. As I say towards the end of this, to admit defeat on these issues is to confirm the idea that the right to have rights belongs only to citizens. But on the contrary, everyone everywhere has rights. And this is a very powerful reminder of that.
So my last entry and the last entry for our story map for this year is about the North Carolina Sanctuary Coalition. So I specifically wanted to research about sanctuaries, the sanctuary movement in North Carolina, because before coming here, I didn't realize how large North Carolina's migrant and refugee populations are. And I think paired with that, we've seen an growing sanctuary movement across the United States. And we see that in North Carolina specifically as well. And in my research, I came across the NC Sanctuary Coalition, and they cite scripture. And interestingly enough, they cite the Bible, but they also cite the Quran. And so in the Bible, they cite Moses saying, "Do not mistreat foreigners living in your land, but treat them just as you treat your own citizens. Love foreigners as you love yourselves, because you were foreigners one time in Egypt." And in the Quran, they cited this scripture that says, "Do good unto your parents and near of kin, and unto orphans and the needy, and the neighbor from among your own people, and the neighbor who is a stranger, and the friend by your side, and the wayfarer." So I thought that was really amazing that they included these 2 quotes, and to show just how interfaith the idea of supporting your neighbor and your fellow stranger, and not having this idea of nationalism and oh, this person is not from my country, or this person is a stranger and so they're not welcome. Across faith, we've seen that scripture really talks about kind of welcoming people and welcoming your neighbor. And so I think the NC Sanctuary Coalition really exemplifies this. And yet they also recognize that sanctuary is a very short-term solution, and it addresses the symptom. So they also advocate for reforms to immigration policy and to make it more humane, because we know that someone living in a church or in another place of worship is not a long-term solution to the kind of very xenophobic immigration policy that we see in the United States. And so they also do that kind of more large-term advocacy. And so that is how we're closing out our story map for this year. The really cool thing about our story map is that it's going to be continued on for future capstone classes. And so if you have any events or human rights leaders or organizations that you think would be really cool to include in our North Carolina map, you can contact us. There's a link right there that takes you to the Human Rights Center's website, and there's like an email icon in the top right, and it'll take you to the email where you can send any of your suggestions, and you can also in the chat send your suggestions or questions that you have. So now we'll open up for discussion. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, and if they're for a specific person or for a specific entry, please say that, and if not, you can just ask a general question to all of us. And thank you.
Yes, one question I've seen a couple times, and I think this is maybe a question for Professor McLean, is whether or not this link will be public, and if so, where they can find it. You're muted.
Hi, everyone. Me again, muted. Yes, first I had to find myself to unmute myself. Yes, we're so glad. I'm really thrilled to see the comments in the chat from teachers and from people who are working on human rights issues in North Carolina. We very much want this map to be a public resource. And in fact, we are hoping to be able to take it on the road in future years and be in parts of the state that are sometimes less well represented, Eastern North Carolina and Western North Carolina. And other places. We do first have to get copyright permissions for everything here. So we will be sending out the video from tonight's event next week. And then in the early part of the summer, we have a graduate student who has agreed to do the permissions contacting for all of us so that we can pay whatever fees we need to and make sure that we're legal and don't get in trouble. But we absolutely want this to be a resource. And as we've said, we're especially interested in sharing it with teachers in North Carolina schools and particularly high school and middle school, where we think these stories could have the most impact and where students in the class felt that that's when they would have loved to have gotten these stories and that they felt the lack of them in their earlier years. So that is our hope, and we will definitely be public. Thank you for that. We also would love to, and then I'll get out of the way so the students can take back over, but we would love to have suggestions from you all. There's a lot of people on here that have a deep history in North Carolina. I can see from scrolling over the participants list. So we are, eager to have your suggestions for other stories that could be marked, and particularly the kinds of stories that we've tried to address here, some of the lesser known stories that really make a big impact and also cross all kinds of boundaries, so that we can see that, as Pauli Murray once said, human rights are indivisible.
Okay, so one question I see in the chat from Andrew O'Brien is he's wondering if it's possible for someone to talk more about Max Roach and Nina Simone. He's curious about what it was like for them to channel their fight for equality through music, and I'll pass it on to Multi and Eritrea.
Yeah, of course. I can go ahead and go first. So I did my entry on Nina Simone, and I actually found a really interesting interview talking directly about that, where Nina Simone, she felt like it was her job, it was her duty. She feels like it's artists' job to speak about the times, to be a voice for everything happening in the nation today. But she also said it was very difficult to take something specifically like the killing of Medgar Evers, for example, and reduce it to 3 minutes and a simple tune, because you're taking this life that meant so much to the movement and meant so much to a community, and you're condensing it into this song that lasts, like she said, that lasts about 3.5 minutes. So while it was very, very important for her to use her voice and to not ignore the plights of African Americans during the civil rights movement, it was also kind of difficult to justify using music, because sometimes music can be I think incorrectly, but music can be viewed as something that's too light to talk about difficult topics with. But as we've seen with Nina Simone, this is how that message has transcended generations. So I think music should absolutely be used as a form of protest and to spread that sort of history. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think Max Roach, like his approach to his music was very similar. And I included in that section of the story map about Max Roach an interview that he did with the Howard University Jazz Oral History Project. You can actually hear in his own words how he felt about music and how he reoriented it around protests around the civil rights movement. And I included a specific caption because the whole thing is an hour long. But if you want to watch the whole thing, that's also great. But he really made a point to talk about how, like, originally that album wasn't even supposed to be about so much about the civil rights movement, but it was supposed to be a commemorative album about the 100-year anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But in an interview, he talked about how it seemed hypocritical, like, why are we celebrating this document that was supposed to abolish slavery? And yet we've seen, like, how Black people continue to be treated in the United States, how they continue to face systemic discrimination, like, how much does this document really do for Black people, or are they truly free? And so I think seeing the current moment and things that were happening, like the arrest of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycotts and the Greensboro sit-ins, like, it really, I think, impacted Max Roach and kind of helped him invigorate him to really make this album more about like anti-establishment, right? And not celebrating this legal document, but saying we still have work to do and this isn't enough. And so I think we see artists today doing that as well. And I think, like Multi said, it really provides us with this like intergenerational legacy to see like how art has been used to express protest, and to express resistance and these visions for change across generations.
I can quickly answer Robert's question in the chat. I know that Josh tried to say something, but I don't think we highlighted this earlier, that alongside our story map, once we publish it, we're also going to have an accompanying site with materials for future research, whether it's for students who are just interested in digging deeper in the history. So like some of the stuff we're planning on including, like you highlighted, are books, articles, videos, documentaries, and then manuscripts that we have here in Duke's Rubenstein Library Collection, and also oral histories that we have from the Southern Oral History program at UNC Chapel Hill. So once we have this all published, just besides all the information we have on our own entries, there's going to be links to a lot of our resources and things we used, so people in their own time can dive deeper.
There's a great question from Professor Kirk. How did this change, if it did, the students' views on how change happens? Anyone want to tackle that one? I can sort of start out. I don't, I won't put it on everyone else. But I think it gave me a better sense of how slowly things happen, truly, and the way that these movements continue even when they don't achieve their goals, and the importance of doing so. The key for me was finding out how all of these local stories connected to these larger, I guess, rights and issues that we talk about mostly happening on an international scale. They're happening in our own backyard and we don't know about it. And we should highlight them, and in highlighting them, it can potentially help that progress move a little faster. So yeah, anyone else?
I think to highlight Polly Murray and specifically her denial from UNC, just thinking about how, and she was actually also a few years after being denied from UNC, denied from Harvard, but on the basis of her sex. So I just think it's interesting how she used all of these rejections truly to fuel her, like she literally said, one woman plus a typewriter constitutes a movement, and her denial from UNC and from Harvard empowered her to create a letter writing campaign to the president of the United States at the time and really tackle the issue of human rights within education. So I think just that also the path isn't linear, and that there is just a constant fight, and often you can't take a rejection as a form of just a letdown, more as just something to keep you going, and kind of just that the hurdles are inevitable. I think that's the kind of the constant throughout all of our different entries, is that there's so many different hurdles that these human rights heroes had to endure. but they endured them. And there is, I think if you want to label it success, but just like light at the end of the tunnel, particularly for Pauli Murray. I know that light eventually came.
Okay, I see another question in the chat. This one's from Gunther Peck, Professor Peck. I'm curious if you all encountered any trade-offs between fighting for human rights and or civil rights as emphasis among activists.
So interestingly enough, I didn't touch on this on in my entry, but you know, there, as opposed to, as dealing with civil rights versus human rights, the UDHR talks about freedom from cruel treatment, unjust treatment in that way as forms of slavery, and and I consider prison labor a modern form of slavery, since they are forced to be in prison and then they are forced to work for little to no pay. And so there's actually basically a loophole in our 13th Amendment that allows for prison labor, because it outlines that you cannot be forced to work in the cases of slavery, indentured servitude, unless you are working for imprisonment, unless you are working to, I guess, pay off your crimes, is another way to say it. So that's an interesting trade-off there, because it's very clearly outlined in the UDHR that this is cruel treatment of prisoners and it's exploiting individuals who are in our prison system. But then we look at our amendment, which protects, which we look at the 13th Amendment, which is supposed to protect our civil rights, and there is an explicit allowance of doing work if it's prisoners. So I just think that's an interesting case of your example, Professor Peck.
So it looks like we're drawing to the end of the questions, but Trey Walk, who is our human rights alum out in the field now, just said, I think you all did a nice job with curating the stories of injustices and the stories of resistance, and painting a complex picture of North Carolina history. So I think that's really helpful. And we already have a couple of more suggestions for things that can go in future iterations of the map, including Floyd McKissick. And there's a new book out about Soul City, the community he founded, and that was his daughter and a human rights stalwart herself, Charmaine McKissick, who put that in. But I was thinking, since we have a few more minutes and we don't seem to have more questions at this point, would you all like to talk about the students, maybe just what this process has been like for you and what you'll be taking away, and or what you'll be taking away, you know, into your post-graduation lives from your human rights study here in North Carolina? You can just go in your usual order and then maybe each call the other one the way you do in class sometimes with the Zooms, just pass the baton.
I'm happy to start. Something that comes to mind right away is the importance of speaking with community members when we're thinking about elevating the voices and stories of those who have come from North Carolina. And I think that will travel with me in the future in whatever work that I do. Particularly in the case of James Lewis Cates Jr., I really thought it was important to speak with individuals in the community and who were a part of his life. And that did a tremendous had a tremendous impact on my ability to really share his story and know what was important about his story to share, and also just made the issue feel a million times more intimate, in that his family still lives in the North Side community and on a street in Chapel Hill that I lived in at one point in my life. So I think that just the importance of speaking with individuals who are truly affected by the issues and the history of what you're trying to share, and how important that is. do you want me to pass, Professor McLean? Okay, I'll pass to Multi. She's right below me.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this process has reminded me how important it is to acknowledge the different aspects and the diverse stories that come with human rights. Like I said, I never knew that the arts could be considered a universal human right, and then there it was in the UDHR. And I really respected everybody's dedication to finding what stories interested them, and then doing all the research and giving us such a variety of topics to choose from to put on our map. And I really enjoyed being able to learn more. I mean, there were stories in our capstone project that I didn't know about, and we only covered North Carolina, and there's still so much left to cover. So it's kind of crazy to think about, you know, if every state somehow was able to do this, what stories they could uncover and what sort of unsung events we don't even know about that we could find out about. So yeah, I guess I really enjoyed that aspect of the project, and I will pass it to Zara.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm going to take away from the process is just learning about digging deeper into stories that you think you already know. Because one of our first discussions we had in our class was talking about what are things we've unlearned during our time at Duke. And I remember one of the things I've unlearned is the civil rights movement, because in high school and middle school, you learn about the movement and you learn about a couple important figures. MLK always comes up, and then, but you never really learn about the other people who are on the ground and doing this important work, like Ella Baker. She was so influential throughout the entire movement, and she doesn't get enough, I don't think, recognition as she deserves for everything that she did. Or even Susan Hill, we hear about Roe v. Wade and the activists who did the work, but do we know their names and what were their contributions? And so just really digging deeper into the people and their contributions. And I think that will really be something that I carry on with me, and I will pass it on to Sarah.
Yeah, I think from this project specifically, I've learned that maybe I'm a little bit wordier than I think I am. Maybe I like more academic vocabulary than I thought I did. And I spent a lot of time with my entries sort of working on how I could cut them down, how I could make it less academic and more interpretive, that was the word we used. And it turned out to be really helpful. I think there's a lot of lessons that I'll take from this about how you can tell a story in a lot fewer words and make it a lot more interesting than just blurting out the facts on a page. So definitely love that part of it. And sort of like Zara was saying, I think something that I'm going to take away, not just from my human rights education at Duke, but my entire education at Duke, is that our histories are a lot more complicated than they appear. Or than we are told. And it's always important to, when someone tells you something about US history or international history, I suppose, and it seems a little too succinct and easy, look into it, because there's surely going to be some like really important facts and figures and events that you don't know about that, you know, aren't being discussed, and that maybe deserve to be highlighted more. I'll pass it to Eritrea.
I think something that was reaffirmed for me through this project is that history is not flat. Like we were often taught, I think, in school, it's like, it was like a really, you know, neat timeline, and this thing happened in this year and this thing happened. But I think history is a lot more dynamic than that. And this, I think through this collective work of like researching and looking through history, I think that became really clear. And like one thing that like stood out to me was like how Sarah talked about sterilizations and the eugenics board in North Carolina. And then Zara talked about Janice Wilson, who had to deal with that, as well as the harms of institutionalization and systemic racism. And so I think across time, we can see how these different events, these different institutions impact one another and inform one another. And so I think it's really important to have this kind of like holistic and dynamic understanding of history in order to kind of better learn how to like change our tactics, or what tactics we can continue to use in the future to keep building. And I will pass to Stiandra.
I think my takeaways are similar to Zara and Sarah, just like being able to pull out those major ideas and think about how to draw people into a story. Because our audience is middle schoolers and high schoolers, I really found myself in my first initial drafts, like using all these different like words from like college and just like and kind of going through the research, like, okay, but like, think about the audience, like, what word choice, think about yourself back in middle school and high school. What were the words? What's the language that would really draw you in? And being able to just like learn from each other and our individual storytelling abilities. I think a lot like Multi within her entries for like Nina Simone in particular, just like seeing how she crafted the story and how she told it, and like kind of helped me in my process of revision. Like, how do I want to tell the story? How do I want to draw readers in and make them really connect to what is taking place, to help them visualize themselves in these stories, in these narratives, as a way to really get them in, really get into the minds of the people who we're talking about. Like a lot of times with research, wanting to keep the subject matter not really altering their voice, like making sure their voice is still heard. And that I'm just kind of highlighting a story, highlighting their experiences. I'm not taking away from the story that they're telling and their narrative. And so I think that was just improving my storytelling ability, something I really valued from this process. And then I will pass to Dan.
Yeah, I mean, you guys all highlighted a lot of really great things. I think for me in particular, I guess, in terms of this project, one, I just really enjoyed the collaborative nature of it. That's just the type of person I am. And I'm very thankful that that is what they decided to do for this capstone. It was so interesting to just look at all the different ideas and events and perspectives every one of us had. And it really helped me grow in my understanding of North Carolina human rights, especially being someone who's not from North Carolina, from New York. This project really gave me a chance to not just highlight the really well-known human rights history in the United States, but look at really specific and particular things. I think for me, when I think of human rights, I mean, it's human rights and it's about the people. And I really enjoyed during the semester more focusing on that, specifically using the connections of my professor to be able to talk with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who's someone who I've learned about and read about, and to be able to talk to him about some of his work and what he does. I think to me that is what human rights is. It's the individuals, and to be able to highlight that and to highlight that as an event in North Carolina, I think is very important to me, and it's something that I know as this project continues to grow and more students like myself are able to investigate and research and really look for these specific examples and details, we're really going to have a beautiful example of these way less known but equally as important human rights events throughout North Carolina, which is extremely exciting, and I think will be an extremely useful tool for high school students throughout the state. Let's see who hasn't talked. I think everyone. Okay, cool.
Wow. Now I think you can all see, some of you I've been talking with over the course of the semester about how incredibly impressive these students are and what a joy it's been to work with them and to learn from them. I mean, this was a collaborative project in every sense. I was learning from you as you were doing your research and coming back with your stories, and bringing these images and the audio and all the other things that you did so well. And I also knew nothing about the technology. So another shout out to Josh for teaching us all, how to manage this and make it. But I'm sure that you all with me want to give a huge applause to these students, even though we're on Zoom and we're all muted. They just did such an extraordinary job. And my heart is really full from listening to them and just hearing their wisdom and thoughtfulness. And, these last comments about what the experience has meant are just beautiful, and my most gratifying teaching experience, frankly, in a 30+ year career. So I'm so pleased with this. And I do want to reiterate that the map will go public as soon as we can get all the permissions, which will probably be like a month, I think, or 6 weeks, maybe, depending on how things go. But if you have registered for this event, you will get a link to the map when it comes out so that you can get it and share it. And I will also be reaching out to different organizations in North Carolina who have contributed to our rich human rights history, and also to teachers and teachers associations to help them know that this is here and they can be part of it. So this will absolutely be ongoing. And I guess I'd just like to say one more thing too, before I hand it back to Multi to close this out. We were looking at a very painful history, as you saw through many of those entries. I think the one that maybe in some ways most, I don't know, there's so much feeling, but Junius Price, who because he was deaf, he was institutionalized and abused for all those years, didn't even get an interpreter, I learned from Zara, until 1992. And yet for every story of pain and indignity and violation that you heard tonight, you also heard about people who worked to change it, people who understood that that was wrong, people who understood that everyone has dignity and that we need to find ways to respect that dignity and to change society so that all human rights are recognized, because we are all one with all the connections you saw tonight. So for me, it's just been an amazing journey to be with these students this semester and to be able to give back this bit of history to our state and to the families and communities of some of the people who made it. So let me then hand it to Multi to close us out. And I thank you all for being with us.
Thanks, Professor. So I just want to thank everybody again for coming. We hope you enjoyed our presentations and hopefully you learned something new today. I know I did throughout the course of this class. These entries mean a lot to us and they just scratch the surface of North Carolina's human rights history. Every single individual is born with human rights and we need to fight for the recognition of these rights. And so we hope that you will join us in doing so. And also everyone is welcome to join the mailing list for the Human Rights Center to learn more about future events and to stay involved with our programming. Thank you again. And yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for coming.
Good night, everyone. And students, we'll see you tomorrow at 10:15 as usual for our last class.